friends, and welcome back into our delve into the examination of the psychology of humor and comedy. And given the recent showing of some truly repugnant behavior in the name of so-called comedy by comedian Michelle Wolf at the White House press conference dinner.
Trump is racist, though. He loves white nationalists, which is a weird term for a Nazi. Calling a Nazi a white nationalist is like calling a pedophile a kid friend.
Oh, wow. She's a little vocal fry there.
A little? It's kind of up there with the Lord of all improv.
Yeah, some of the shit that she said was just absolutely unbearable. I'm not just talking about the quality of the jokes themselves. You are being a scathing, vile cunt. But moreover, we could also look at the recent critical failure, surmise my surprise, of Amy Schumer's latest film, I Feel Pretty, which even Bill Maher said is just the Nutty Professor.
Where someone not thin and not cool magically sees themselves as better looking and gains confidence.
But rather than starring the hilarious Eddie Murphy, performing the difficult task of playing multiple roles simultaneously and interacting with himself.
Nation is a beautiful thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of, especially to young people. I think it's
your whole Edmund.
You know, sometimes when I'm alone, I relate to myself.
I can relate.
Mama.
Has pretty much just been recreated by Schumer, so instead of a funny guy like Eddie Murphy, it's a fat pig in a sausage casing, talking about my vagina. Oh, and of course, by the way, the Eddie Murphy film being itself a remake of an earlier version of The Nutty Professor. Really? Amy Schumer? Stealing jokes? Oh, that's impossible.
Blacking out is when you drink so much that your brain goes to sleep, but your body gets all Eye of the Tiger and soldiers on.
And I black out when I drink. Isn't that the worst? No, your mind goes to sleep, but your body's like, tonight is my night.
Something that is kind of funny, though, about its reception is that it's not just people who, I don't know, like films and humor in general who disliked her latest attempt. It's actually been lambasted by feminists for, you know, despite being a film with a supposed feminist message, not being feminist enough. Anyway, so given these two events and just the topic in general being of interest, I think, to a lot of people, it's time to tackle one of the biggest elephants in the room when it comes to humor. And I'm not referring to Schumer herself there, no. I'm referring to the question, are women funny? And I know the answer that probably most of you are expecting from me is...
Hell no, to the no, 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 yeah, to the no.
But, that's not going to be the answer, I don't think. And a bit of an aside before we begin here, I was referred several times while I was investigating this, not just by people on Twitter or in DMs who were aware that I was researching women in comedy, but in actual scientific articles themselves. That's for real. To a 2007 article in Vanity Fair by Christopher Hitchens on this topic, titled Why Women Aren't Funny. I specifically, though, avoided reading that perspective because I feared that if I read Hitchens' article when I started, it would color my opinion, and I wouldn't be able to really go into the research with more of an open mind. Being that it was an article designed to discuss the topic at a more layman level, I worried that there was a potential for it to really color my perspective in reading of the data. I mean, data are, but it is possible to misinterpret. However, in retrospect, and upon completing my research, to the degree that I found sufficient on this topic, I gotta say, I guess the short answer really is no, but it's not no for the reasons you might think that it is. And if you're interested, I would very highly suggest that you go and read it, as Hitchens does come to most of the same conclusions that I will over the course of this video. Well, normally I like to trot out a bunch of studies and research and lay it all out in a nice little package before I come to an answer or a conclusion to a question that I'm posing. But in this video, I'm going to state the answer to the question up front. And it's not no. It is yes. The basic question, are women funny? Yes, of course some women are funny. The real thing that people are saying when they say women aren't funny is not that it's impossible for women to be funny. It's just that women probably aren't as funny, or they aren't as funny as often, or they're funny in different ways, or they're more funny to other women and men don't appear to appreciate it as much. All things that we're going to go over as I go forward. Humor is highly and inexorably subjective. Some people will find women funny in some contexts, so yes, women can be funny. It's just the degree to which and in what situations. In the first installment, I mentioned the Wits 3 model that describes about 40% of humor as falling into the categories of incongruity resolution, nonsense, and sexual humor. and sexual humor will be a big topic of today's video. But the Wits 3, as I mentioned, only describes general categories of what humor is. It doesn't describe whether or not something is funny, and when we do look at studies that assess whether or not something is perceived of as funny, we will see that people differentiate from each other in pretty specific ways, based on personal differences. In this instance, we're going to be looking a lot at how men and women differ simply in what they find funny and unfunny, what kind of humor they prefer. In other words, we can't really get at what definitively makes something funny. We can define general categories that describe what is funny, but there is no magic solution. There is no humor equation. This is perhaps best illustrated in a quote that's been attributed to a number of different people, including Mark Twain, but this one I believe directly comes from E.B. White, and that is this. Humor can be as dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process, and the innards are discouraging to any but the purely scientific mind. Thus, we need to understand as we go forward the mutable, volatile, and highly subjective nature of humor. Sure, we can analyze it all day, but in analyzing it, it ceases to be funny, and therefore what are we looking at besides a dead frog? R.I.P. in peace, Pepe. Speaking of killing humor as his creator sure seems to be wont to do. So to begin, short answer, yes, women can be funny, based on one's subjective experience and enjoyment of humor, as well as potentially based on various other differences in gender perceptions and enjoyment of humor, the type of humor being utilized by the woman, and the context in which the humor is being used. What I think we will find by the end is not so much, again, that women cannot be funny, but that they don't have as much of a reason from an evolutionary social standpoint to be as funny as men, or to use humor as often as men, and that some types of humor thereby are simply unexpected when they arise from women, describing potentially a negative expectancy violation, rather than a positive one, describes what comedy is, expectancy violation. And as an extension of that, not only are we perhaps a bit socially confused by funny women, given we don't expect it, there also are certain types of humor that they should probably just avoid. All topics, again, we will discuss in depth. But yes, women can be funny. And to start out, I wanted to show, well, as much as fair use allows, and there is no question I'm going to spend fucking weeks fighting copyright claims over this, but fuck it, I'm going to show a few clips from a few of my favorite female comedians designed to make a very specific point about the capacity, but maybe not the normalcy, the capacity though, for women to be funny. And hey, that's fair use, goddammit. I'm commenting and critiquing. But again, humor is subjective, and while we can categorize it and measure perceptions of humor and funniness in aggregate and in general, I ask you determine for yourselves if you find any of these women who I love funny. First, Kathleen Madigan.
The Irish do like to drink, and we're good at it, though. We're almost like Olympic drinkers. We're that good at drinking. That's why I think DUIs based on your height and weight is ridiculous, because I am a small person, but I can drink a lot. I think DUIs should be based on your nationality. And if I get pulled over, I should be able to be honest with the cop. And if he says, "Have you been drinking?" I should be able to go, "Yes, I've had 3 beers." And then he looks at my license and goes, "Oh, your last name's Madigan. Wow, you could have had 8. And then I go home.
Now, perhaps I'm a little bit biased because a large portion of your humor is based around being drunk and Irish, so, maybe state your biases there a bit. Maybe it's a little bit of disposition theory, something we'll get into. Next, I want to bring up Natasha Leggero, who I would say often violates a lot of what I'm going to talk about, and might actually get some pushback from you guys in the comments, given her husband is the insufferably unfunny Moshe Kasher. But I think she's pretty hilarious. And I think it's because she's obviously playing a character that's supposed to be a spoiled slutty whore, rather than her herself just being a spoiled slutty whore, as others like Amy Schumer or Lena Dunham generally are. And actually, in this bit, you can hear how a man in the audience gets offended about the truth that she's disseminating. And I want to bring this bit up later, because, she's horrifyingly accurate at explaining this entire phenomena, at least on some level, and in a more humorous way.
The women's movement ruined a permanent vacation for all of us. We were having fun. Our dad would give some guy some land and some cows, and we wouldn't have to do anything. And if we wanted something from our husband, we'd just twist our dimples and talk like a baby.
Please, Mr. Sweetie, buy me a dress. Write me a check.
And then if you didn't get what you wanted, you just faint.
But finally, I just can't talk about funny women without mentioning my main mommy, the water champion, Christina Pazsitzky.
Now, I'm not saying that this generation hasn't had its share of hardships. I mean, who can forget the great gluten intolerance? Or the peanut allergies that ravage the nation's kindergartens? Or the horrors of dial-up internet? I can't say it!
And while she is hilarious on my favorite podcast, Your Mom's House, that she co-stars in with her husband, Tom Segura, who I must admit is probably funnier than she is, just on average. Sorry, Mommy Tina. I have to also be honest that she tends toward a lot of the same flaws and pitfalls as other female comedians, in terms of talking a lot about sex and talking a lot about her body and how gross and disgusting it is. Just doesn't do anything for me, and I think we'll get into why. Still, I hope I have given you guys a few examples of funny women and how they can be funny, even if it is potentially different from how men can be funny. And your interpretation of their funniness may be very much different from mine. You may have thought all of those clips were insufferably unfunny. That's up to you. I can only say, I find them to be funny. So let's get into the real topic. As we delve into this, let's first look at how men and women differ in their perceptions of comedy, in how we, the two sexes, find different things to be funny. We know that given the subjectivity of humor, it's pretty much impossible to make any kind of broad and total generalized statements that women aren't funny, for again, anyone could find almost anything funny. Therefore, instead, I think we should begin our investigation in looking at how the sexes perceive of humor and comedy differently. Mundorf, Banta, Zillman, Lester, and Robertson 1988 examined differences in perceived funniness of different comedic elements, including both jokes and humorous cartoons, across men and women, and found noticeable differences. Not super surprising. Again, sexual dimorphism. Similar to what we've seen with the previous video in the research of Rutsch, 1990, both men and women tended to prefer content that utilized incongruity resolution, that is a type of mental problem solving regarding a joke, rather than pure nonsense humor. As we learned, that tends to be mostly preferred by children. But in adults, again, more preference in both sexes towards incongruity resolution. In a finding that we will see over and over again, though, Mundorf et al. Noted specifically that women tended to enjoy sexual humor considerably less so than men. Sexual humor is a distinct category of humor according to the Wits 3 model, and it maintains a unique status because it simply is isolated from the other two variables. Even when a joke or piece of comedy utilizes elements of incongruity resolution or nonsense, when it includes a sexual element, it becomes distinct. And we can see that when we look at how sexual humor is received differently by the audiences. In this case, gender difference being perhaps the most notable. When I spoke about persuasion and learning, sexual humor is almost always found to be inappropriate in a learning environment, and because of that, it means that sexual humor was not related to learning in any of the research I looked at. In fact, it could actually be associated with reduced learning outcomes, because it's violating an expectation, but not in a positive way. What Mundorf et al. Found, though, is that women do not appear to enjoy sexual humor as much as men do, and there may be an evolutionary basis for that, as we will come to discuss. An interesting effect, what the authors propose may be attributable to disposition theory, that is, the proclivity of viewers of a piece of media, be it a play, a film, stand-up act, etc., to develop a positive or negative villain or hero disposition. That is, that we tend to identify a protagonist within the players in a media context, and we want to root for that protagonist for any number of reasons. It could be their morality, but often it's because the protagonist is similar to us in some way. And in contrast, of course, we root against the villain. But as with most things, involved in our disposition and the formation of the opinions we have towards media players is in part our propensity to have affinity towards those who are more similar to us than those who are dissimilar. And, for example, Mundorf and his colleagues found in their analysis that women enjoyed comedic bits that portrayed males as the victim or butt of a joke, rather than women as the butt of a joke. This may explain why so many advertisements for household products portray the husband as a drooling, babbling idiot, incapable of barely tying his own shoes, let alone complete any of the tasks that must be left to the valiant woman hero.
Some people will try anything for more cleaning power.
The woman, of course, being the target of the advertisement's humorous appeal. She's the hero. She's the protagonist. In contrast, in this study, men did not have a preference when it came to seeing either men or women as the target or victim in either jokes or comic strips. So again, men like sexual humor more, and men don't really mind seeing women as the butt of a joke. But women seem to prefer seeing men as the victims. Over a decade later, Herzog 1999 sought to replicate the findings of Mundorf et al., and was able to, for the most part, but included the variable of explicitness in humor. That is, in the last video, if you remember, we discussed the findings of Cunningham and Dirks 2005, who found that the longer a joke took to be perceived of as, well, just that, a joke, the less funny it was considered to be. Thus, we know that the explicitness of a joke may affect its perceived comedic value. And similarly, the later data from Herzog indicated that both men and women preferred more explicit jokes. This is pretty much in line with the findings of Mundorf, in that both men and women prefer incongruity resolution humor over nonsense humor. Again, when talking about the explicitness of a joke, that doesn't mean that everyone always loves being asked, hey, what's the deal with airline food? No, it's more that people want to understand that what they're listening to is humor, it's a joke. This is sort of part of the audience-performer contract when we look at stand-up comedy. But in general, we need to know that what we're reading is supposed to be humorous. Or watching or listening to, but in many of these studies they had people read jokes or look at comic strips. But as mentioned before, very clear jokes are just generally funnier than more esoteric and particularly long-winded jokes. But similarly to the previous decade-old research, women still dislike sexual humor, and particularly disliked sexual humor when women were the subject or the butt of the joke. Again, similar findings. Interestingly, the study was not a total one-to-one replication, in that Herzog found there had been a total increase in women's overall appreciation and enjoyment of humor since the Mundorf data collection. This indicates a potential change in culture, or at least in what is socially acceptable, that over time women have come to be more appreciative of humor in general, but they are still highly averse to sexual humor. That's, pretty goddamn interesting when you consider that the majority of female comics, at least stand-ups, seem so obsessed with humor centered around their stinky barnyard pussies, now isn't it? I may have an answer, but it's not really a great one. Because what we see, at least in the data, is that other women don't like it very much. They don't like to see women being lewd. They don't like to see anyone being lewd, but other women don't seem to like it so much when you engage in sexual humor. So what is happening with all of these women who love Amy Schumer and Lena Dunham? Maybe we can go back to that idea of disposition theory, of just preferred liking of others who are similar to us through an effect of homophily. Maybe women just like Amy Schumer because she's a woman, making men the victims of her grotesque jokes about the smell of her filthy clam. We saw that women were more okay with humor that victimized men. Could that also maybe be why we saw even women at large were pretty pissed off at Michelle Wolf's hideous degradation of Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the White House Correspondents' dinner? I mean, have you guys heard this? It's awful, and it's not funny.
I actually really like Sarah. I think she's very resourceful. Like, she burns facts, and then she uses that ash to create a perfect smoky eye. Like, maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's lies. It's probably lies. And I'm never really sure what to call Sarah Huckabee Sanders. You know, is it Sarah Sanders? Is it Sarah Huckabee Sanders? Is it Cousin Huckabee? Is it Auntie Huckabee Sanders? Like, what's Uncle Tom but for white women who disappoint other white women? Oh, I know, Aunt Coulter.
She was attacking another woman, though. It wasn't a man who was the butt of the joke. Yes, her jokes at the expense of Mike Pence and Trump certainly got more laughs, not only from the audience, but sparked considerably less outrage from the media and from the internet at large than her attacks on Kellyanne Conway and Huckabee Sanders.
We're so sorry that that happened. It's there's no excuse for that. I mean, women should support other women, and I just wanted to get your reaction because I thought you handled it with grace and with class.
And by the way, I know I played a little bit of it before, but this entire stand-up routine was punctuated with actual fucking audience response sections like it's a goddamn interactive children's show at Chuck E. Cheese.
We're gonna try a fun new thing, okay? I'm gonna say Trump is so broke, and you guys go, how broke is he? All right? Trump is so broke. How broke is he? He has to fly failed business class.
It's just not funny, lass. But let's look into it a little bit more. The disparity between the sexes and appreciation for humor does not appear to end just there, with sex humor aversion in women. For example, Schwartz, Hoffman, and Hutter 2015 examined advertisement preferences in detail and found that men tended to prefer satirical humor, while women tended to prefer sentimental humor advertisements. Again, we're going back to some of that stuff that we saw earlier. Women tend to prefer humor when it's a bit more emotional, a bit more relative, and a bit more self-affirming. Maybe that's why, again, ads targeted at selling things to women are so disparaging and anti-male, because seeing the man as a victim is more funny to women.
This is not a good idea.
Oh, no, it's fine. You did track in middle school.
You got this. You got it. It's on you.
Which urgent care do you want to try this time?
Oh, this one's only a mile away.
Ooh, and it's in network.
You got this. It's gonna be awesome. Steve. I thought you were gonna land in the pool.
Whereas men, in contrast, tended to prefer more complex jokes and satire. And that can potentially play a role, again, as we move forward, so keep it in mind. But potentially much more interesting, fMRI data show that male and female brains simply respond differently to primes of humorous content. Cohn, Kellerman, Schneider, and Habel 2010 conducted neurological research using the fMRI equipment to examine the differences in how humor is processed in the minds of men and women. The data forward distinct differences in the parts of the brain as participants were shown a humorous cartoon for males and females, particularly in the emotional centers of the brain. That is, it seems that in women, the parts of the brain that were more active when looking at funny stimuli were the same centers of the brain associated with emotional perception, the amygdala. In other words, when being shown something funny, the emotional center, that is, processing that something is emotive in nature, was more active in women. In very stark contrast, men tended to show greater activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, an area of the brain that has been associated with emotional regulation rather than emotional recognition. I cannot say definitively what these data mean, but I can speculate. For women, it seems, humor is more of an emotional thing. For men, it seems, humor, while emotive, is still more of a cognitive process. The researchers suggested there was just more processing going on in the male brain than the female brain in general, and as such, well, that supports my hypothesis. Earlier research isolated similar differences in male and female processing of humor. Azim, Mobbs, Joe, Menon, and Reese 2005, and this is the study that's cited in the Hitchens article, found that response time to jokes was faster in males than in females, meaning that men recognized jokes faster. However, similar to the Cohn, Kellerman, Schneider, and Habel data, Azim et al. Found that male brains forwarded activation of the temporal-occipital junction, the temporal pole, and the superior temporal gyrus, as well as the inferior frontal gyrus, when looking at funny versus unfunny cartoons. In contrast, females forwarded activation in the temporal-occipital junction, the temporal pole, and the superior temporal gyrus, and then extending into the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, inferior frontal gyrus, and into the middle frontal gyrus. Whew, that's a lot for me to say, when looking at a funny versus an unfunny cartoon. What this indicates is that women had greater potential for emotional response once they got the joke. Again, it's the more emotive centers. Even if it did take them longer to get it, they were also more aware of the unfunniness of a joke, rather than its funniness potentially. Regardless, though, of the meaning behind this, it demonstrates definitively that men and women process humor differently, not only on a psychological level, but actually on a physiological level, with women thinking more of humor on an emotional level, and men potentially thinking of humor more critically. Although again, that's just my speculation. So, we've seen that men and women perceive of humor in disparate manners, both in terms of their stated preference, and even within the activated areas of the brain. Thus, the next question to ask is, do men and women use humor differently, given that we seem to respond to humor differently? Last time I mentioned a single measure of propensity for humor. That's Booth Butterfield and Booth Butterfield's 1991 instrument of humor orientation. Hi-ho, mo-ho, and low-ho. Easy to remember because it sounds hilarious. But that instrument asked the respondent to report on their own use of humor and the typical response they perceive of from their uses of humor from others. Myers, Ropog, and Rogers' 1997 in an examination of humor orientation across the sexes found that men reported more attempts at humor, perceived themselves as funnier overall, or higher in humor orientation in this case, and used more disparaging or negative attempts at humor than women did. So at least via self-report, men consider themselves to be funnier, and consider themselves to use humor more than women. Further, Martin Pullock, Doris Larson, Gray, and Weir 2000 found that while both men and women utilized humor, they engaged in the uses of very different types of humor, and this is going to go back to preferences as well. Males did use significantly more humor in general than women did in communication, which supports the findings of Myers, Ropog, and Rogers outside of just self-report, meaning that it's not just perception. Men do engage in more usage of humor. But of particular interest to note, males engaged in more potentially what we could call aggressive humor, such as sarcasm, ridicule, and both self and other disparagement, while women predominantly engage in affiliative and self-affirming humor. And just through anecdotal observations, that seems accurate. Listen to a lot of female stand-ups, even my favorites. They tend to talk a lot about the self. And while all of these attempts at humor may be perceived of as funny, again, given that it's based on the individual perceiver and their subjective taste, it indicates a succinct difference in male and female humor usage, and I really think that it is evident in comedy at large. I really, really hate that I have to keep up bringing Amy Schumer. But she's just such a perfect, big, fat example of everything wrong with women in comedy. All of her attempts at humor are self-affirming and anti-male and sexual in nature. So who the fuck does that appeal to? Well, let's go back to Disposition Theory. It appeals very highly to other slutty women, pretty much almost exclusively. And let's look at her fan base, and who is it? Other slutty, fat women. They look like Amy Schumer, they think like Amy Schumer, and they like her because of homophily pretty much exclusively. And they probably enjoy that she puts down men. But really, let's get as far into this as we can, alright? Not into Amy Schumer, oh god, please no. Into humor in general. I know I said that humor is subjective, but let's look at a few examinations of the perceptions of comedians versus comedians as funny. And I think we'll find a couple of other interesting things to pull out here. Shepard, 1985, and yeah, I know it's dated, but if we look at the Herzog data from above, we have every reason to believe that while it's changed a little, it hasn't changed a lot. And that's why I think it's important to bring up here, as I haven't been able to find a whole ton of research on the perceptions of funniness of stand-up comedians or of comedies in general from a more quantitative stance. And particularly, I want to pull this one out because the researcher specifically assessed stand-ups versus men and women. And it is without question that stand-ups are far less likely to be women than they are to be men. That's just the reality. There aren't a lot of female stand-ups, and I think we'll get into that a little bit, what it may mean and why that may be, even though there certainly are women in comedy. They don't really tend to go into stand-up. Anyway, Shepard 1985 found that male comedians were preferred by both male and female participants in their study. Female comedians' use of comedy tended to focus more on pro-social messages, less on self-disparaging or other disparaging humor than their male counterparts. This did not mean that no one enjoyed the female comedians, however. Gender disparity did arise, though, across participants. Men reported Lily Tomlin to be the 5th funniest performer across all of the stand-ups assessed, while women viewed her as the 2nd funniest. Again, we can go back to disposition theory and homophily as a predisposal to like those who are more similar to us. For us gals to stick together or something, I guess. Again, it potentially explains why Amy Schumer has any audience at all. In contrast, though, Mikas et al. 2012 had men and women create captions for cartoons and then asked participants to rate the memorability of the captions, and found that both men and women rated cartoons written by male participants there on the spot as more memorable, thus indicating potentially that yes, the humor of men may just be enjoyed more across both sexes, even when the gender of the creator is unknown. This is where the importance of qualitative research, actually talking to people, and getting their perspectives on any sort of question is important. Bohr, 2010, conducted a series of multiple focus group-based interviews with participants in the United Kingdom and Norway. Both male and female participants watched a series of sketch television shows that featured either predominantly male or female actors, and she asked participants in a roundtable-style discussion about their opinions on said shows. While participants enjoyed both, they seemed to prefer the sketch shows that predominantly starred men, with a female participant noting even, interestingly, that while she liked the setup for some of the jokes, she found the behavior and actions of the female actors essentially to be surprising and therefore unpleasant. This finding was similarly replicated in qualitative research from Coupier's 2006, who interviewed participants and asked about their enjoyment of various Dutch male and female stand-up comedians, and found that the female comics were frequently perceived of as, quote, inappropriate. In other words, it seems we're getting back a little bit here to expectancy violation theory, aren't we? That maybe there's something about female comics that we're not expecting to happen. But we learned in the first installment that expectancy violation is an important element of humor, right? That having a positive expectation violation is essentially what creates incongruity resolution, and therefore makes something more funny both for men and women. So what's happening here? What is it about women that makes their violations seem more, well, violating? As we found in the first installment, disparaging and negative humor is unrelated to learning outcomes. See, again, Wanzer, Freimeyer, and Irving, 2010. So are there maybe other effective uses of negatively valenced humor that may affect why women are perceived of as less funny, or potentially more accurately, why their usage of humor are less anticipated and therefore potentially socially uncomfortable? Could it be the type of humor or its origin from women that are forwarding this response of non-anticipation? Well, the answer to that may lie in human evolution and mating behaviors. Bressler-Bolshine 2005 exposed male and female participants to images of people of the opposite sex that were paired up with either humorous or non-humorous statements, and asked participants to rate the attractiveness of the person in the image. Humor-paired messages increase the desirability only of women toward potential male partners. In contrast, both men and women viewed the humor-paired prospective partners as less intelligent and trustworthy. Of particular note, women rated lower physical attractive men. The physical attractiveness of individuals was assessed in a pretest to determine general physical attractiveness, not by these participants. But the lower on the physical attractiveness scale men, if they used humor, were rated by women to be particularly more untrustworthy than attractive men. However, both men and women rated humorous others as socially adept. In other words, what this means is that women are attracted to funny men, but it helps if they're also physically attractive, because if they're not, they may be viewed as particularly untrustworthy, perhaps using humor in order to con the woman or something.
He thinks that if a woman sees a guy put on a better show, she'll walk out on his show, go see the other show.
What? Oh, should we leave? Maybe you don't have to be so funny. I mean, would it kill you not to be so funny all the time? That's all I'm asking. This woman thinks I'm very funny, and now you're gonna be funny, so what am I gonna be? I'm gonna be a short, bald guy with glasses who suddenly doesn't seem so funny.
While in contrast, funniness of women had absolutely no impact on men's interest in fucking abroad. Similarly, DiDonato, Bedminster, and Mackel, 2012, examined romantic partner preferences based on use of humor longitudinally, rather than just immediately, as the Bressler and Bolshine. I'm so sorry, doctor, I can't help myself. Anyway, where was I? The long-term preferences versus short-term preferences in engaging in romantic relationships across men and women based on various use of different humor styles. Overall, men were just more interested in relationships with women in general. Men want to have sex with women, well, imagine my shock. And similarly, men were particularly interested in short-term relationships with women. In other words, fucking for fucking sake. But in women, a trend quickly emerges in that women's desire to engage in long-term relationships with men is in fact potentially based on their use of humor. While men were slightly less interested in engaging in long-term relationships with women who used negative, disparaging humor, and women similarly found negative humor to be less desirable when it came from men, both for the short and long-term relationships, positive use of humor from men was related fairly significantly to increased desire from women to engage in long-term relationships. In other words, funny guys are more likely to be considered by women to be marriage material.
It is, when you get married, that's what happens, you get fat. And plus, I married a big guy. Like husky, just healthy. Not so fat that he beats you in a wet t-shirt contest, that's gross. My husband's just fat enough that when he rolls over in bed at night, I get to hear the sweet sound of Sweet sound of sleep apnea. I love it.
The data also indicate that women who use negative humor were perceived of as less warm than men who use negative humor. However, interestingly, positive humor utilized by women was also associated with slightly lower perceptions of warmth. Again, it's slight. Thus, warmth, a trait that we often consider to be more feminine and loaded in its orientation, is perceived of as lower in women who use humor, who use comedy. Perhaps because use of comedy itself is again inconsistent with what we expect from women. And we find not only do women prefer funny men, but they're more likely to want the funny guy to put a ring on it. So why might it be that despite the perceptions of lower trustworthiness, that women are attracted to humor? Well, scholars such as Miller 2000 in an examination of sexual selection theory suggest that humor may be just one of many, many aspects that men predominantly have developed to serve as signifiers of their sexual value to women in the place of physical exemplars. Humans are actually low in sexual dimorphism compared to many other species. Consider instead the peacock, who can attract the female through a display of his plumage.
Remarkable bird, the Norwegian blue. Beautiful plumage, isn't it?
The plumage don't enter into it. It's stone dead.
Instead, women are the selectors of mates, and therefore the determiners of genetic propagation within our species. We're the ones who determine the value of mates. Sexual selection theory thereby may include all sorts of social and physical skills as methods by which men can attract women outside of just their physical bodies. These skills can include everything from intelligence, artistry, musical talent, technical ability, and fuck, now I feel like I'm describing a D&D character sheet a bit. But finally, communication skill or oratory ability, and falling under that umbrella, well, humor. In other words, it could be argued that men developed a sense of humor as a way of attracting women, as our species' sort of version of displaying plumage, at least some sort of non-physical factor of displaying plumage, of, again, as I've described before, demonstrating one's value.
I wait till you're done with them, and then I swoop in, give them a shoulder to cry on, and then we hump. Oh, you been humping these girls after I'm done with them? Oh yeah, dude. I come in as the sensitive intellectual type. Why do you think I'm always reading books and shit when we do the spider routine?
I thought you were just my wingman, though.
No, I'm swimming in your wake.
And because women are the mate selectors, they simply don't need to engage in these same behaviors in order to attract mates. Women get to select the mates. They don't really need to attract them through anything other than being physically attractive or being physically female, really. Thus, women simply have no evolutionary reason to become comedians. While again, this doesn't preclude women from being funny, it does raise the question of why. Natasha Leggero said it fairly succinctly in that clip that I played in the outset, did she not? Women want to select the best partner to reproduce his genes. They don't want the most amount of partners. And while males seek the maximalization of partners, or at least the maximalization of spreading their genes.
All right, keep it floppy. Haul it, ball it, never call it. Girls are objects. Yeah!
Well, then it makes sense why men become comedians, why they engage in a public display of their value. And while I recently discussed this in detail in my video on incels, we have developed social norms that discourage this kind of behavior both in men and women, in terms of discouraging the majority of women to seek the Chad alpha male, and the majority of men to just try and spread their seed rampantly. Comedy is clearly attractive to women, as we've seen, and while it's not inherently unattractive to men, it has no real effect on their perception of wanting to bang any given woman more or less than they would naturally. Generally, it seems that when women use humor, it has no effect on their attractiveness, but it does maybe confuse us and cause us to see women as less warm, less feminine. And why is that again? Well, because comedic behavior serves no real evolutionary purpose in women. There's no reason for them to be engaging in comedy. Again, doesn't mean they can't. Humor is obviously just one element in determining sexual attraction, as status always also plays a role. We also looked at how physical attractiveness played a role in this, in terms of women rating men who were physically attractive as more trustworthy when they used humor than men who were physically unattractive. But the role that other elements play in here further emphasizes the evolutionary nature of humor as a method of sexual selection in human mating and social interaction. Greengrass and Miller 2008 examined partner selection and a number of other factors, including personality factors, which I will be doing an additional video on and cover there, but of greater interest to this video are the findings of attractiveness, status, and joke valence on attraction. Use of negative humor was viewed as less attractive than humor in general across all conditions, negative humor being attacking humor, but particularly so when it originated from low status individuals. individuals. Those were people with low GPAs who lacked a car or had come from a family with low income in this college student-based survey. In contrast, well, unsurprisingly, high GPA people from rich families with cars were perceived of generally as more attractive. Self-deprecating humor had less of an effect when it was high-status people using self-deprecating humor on perceptions of attractiveness. But again, across both high and low-status individuals, other deprecating humor was consistently viewed as the least attractive form of humor. And I should point out that this is talking about sexual attraction. This is not talking about liking. We can like someone without finding them sexually attractive, and vice versa. But when we look at the point and the purpose of humor from an evolutionary standpoint, well, negative humor is least effective at apparently eliciting a sexual attraction response. This is not to say you can't like someone who uses other disparaging humor. For example, everybody likes Mr. Medicare, and pretty much what he does is other disparaging humor. Doesn't mean you can't like him, or that you wouldn't like him, or that we would have no reason to like slam comics. It just means when it comes to attractiveness, positive humor seems to be the way to go. In other words, humor increases female attraction towards men.
Funny guy! Right here!
By the way, you never said anything to George about Jerry and me, did you? Oh, please, it's in the vault.
Jerry Seinfeld's a funny guy!
But that's not a be-all and end-all, as status and physical attractiveness will come into play in any sort of social attraction. What is of import to note, though, is that no one seems to find shit-talkers particularly attractive as potential romantic partners. It seems there is a sexual component of humor, and that this component originates from an evolutionary standpoint. Thus, it is not so much that women cannot be funny or are not funny, but really that we just don't expect them to be funny because they have no reason to be. Again, Christopher Hitchens in his essay on this topic comes to a very similar conclusion as I just have here. Well, Aiden, that sounds fucking terrible. Here it is. You've come to the conclusion. Proof of sexism in our society that we feel uncomfortable when women use humor, and thereby, regardless of the fact that all of this stuff has increased over time, as we saw in the beginning, we must certainly treat them differently when they use humor because of the rampant sexism. Well, maybe. I wouldn't question that there are fewer female stand-ups, but that's because, as Natasha Leggero herself described, female stand-ups don't get the social and sexual rewards for doing stand-up that men likely do.
I don't even know why I do comedy. Like, you look at guys and you're like, no one on the bill tonight, but a lot of these guys, they do comedy so they can get laid. And I'm like, I wonder why I do comedy. I don't think it's to bed the audience members. Oh yeah, fucking kill with my Rite Aid joke. Wonder how many of these audience balls I can fit in my mouth.
As we have seen from the potential evolutionary and romantic sexual research on this, it is a highly stressful job, an incredibly competitive one, that inherently lacks a major positive outcome for women that it possesses in contrast for men. It's almost like, as James Damore described in his now infamous memo, that men and women want different things out of a job. At large, women have no reason to be funny. That doesn't mean that they aren't. What do we see instead of a lot of female stand-ups? We see a lot of women who go behind the scenes as writers or more directly actresses. I mean, I love Amy Poehler's character in Parks and Rec, just as I love Liz Lemon in 30 Rock, as much as I may despise the politics of both the characters and the comedians behind them.
I told you so, Leslie. This is what happens when the government interferes with business. Government is bad, business is good, free market.
Capitalism is the only way, Leslie. It moves our country forward. It's what makes America great, and England okay, and France terrible.
Teachers should get paid $1 million a year. If birth control pills fixed boners, you would get them free with your driver's license. And how do we know that God isn't a tree?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Elizabeth Lemon. And this is what we're up against.
But there's seemingly plenty of funny female characters on TV, right? Again, I have to go back to Parks and Rec. I love April Ludgate. She's my fucking favorite.
I wanted to make fun of stupid people while I get drunk. My two true passions.
And I really like Kimmy Schmidt.
So this is feminism. Oof, didn't know it hurt my feet so much.
But writing and acting are quite different from stand-up, now aren't they? I mentioned earlier that I was particularly interested in how people rated the funniness of female stand-ups, because there aren't a whole lot of them. There are a lot of women working, again, behind the scenes. And I think we can explain that by seeing that there are potentially more social benefits by working behind the scenes. I'm not saying that acting is easier necessarily, or that writing is less stressful, but I think that the lack of having to perform live does allow for more appeal to these sorts of positions rather than stand-up. Thus, perhaps why we see more women in these sorts of comedic roles and positions rather than in the stand-up scene. This is just speculation, however, and generally speaking, I hate speculation. Thus, moving away from it, let's look at how humor used across the sexes is perceived of in a professional interview environment. If this is really hurting women in some way. If modern society is truly as sexist and broken as it is often portrayed by feminist media, then we would expect the use of humor from women to negatively impact perceptions of them in the business world, right? After all, we're not expecting it. Well, no, that doesn't appear to be the case. Gallagher 2010 examined the potential effects of these kinds of expectancy violations on perceptions of men and women utilizing humor during an interview, with actors playing the interviewees and with the participants in the study playing the role of the interviewers. And they found no effects of sex and humor use on interviewer ratings of the Confederates. Interestingly, the type of humor did not appear to have any effect on the ratings either. Across humor and non-humor conditions, men and women were rated similarly regardless of whether or not they even used humor, and regardless of if they used self-affirming and affiliative humor, which, as we know, is preferred by women, or more aggressive negative humor, which, as we know, is more preferred by men. The only seeming gender effect was not in the ratings towards the interviewees, but in reaction to humor in general, which was higher in the female interviewers, the participants. And again, that's kind of unsurprising, given that we know there are differences in how men and women process humor information. In other words, being a funny woman does not appear to be a detriment in a professional environment. If you're funny in an interview, it's not going to put you at a disadvantage if you're a woman. Women are not, therefore, more likely to be excluded from any individual field because they are funny, if they are funny. Thus, I don't believe women are being kept out of comedy because they're being sexually discriminated against, but probably just because people find female comedians confusing on some sort of fundamental and evolutionary level. That doesn't mean that we can't have women in comedy and television and writing. In fact, quite the opposite. We see plenty of that. Just stand-up? Yeah, it lacks the evolutionary basis. Thus, in an overview, what have we learned about women in comedy? Women tend to be less likely to use humor than men. They also tend to perceive themselves as less funny in general than men. Additionally, women use different types of humor from their male counterparts. While men generally prefer more aggressive or negatively valenced types of humor in their own usage, women tend to prefer socially affirming and affiliative humor. Women and men also enjoy different types of humor, with women tending to be more averse to sexual humor, and men again more prone to enjoy satire. Except potentially when that sexual humor is victimizing the male. But in general, yes, they tend to be averse to sexual humor in comparison to men. The only seeming case in which this is not necessarily evident is when the comedian engaging in the sexual humor is a comedian, another woman, as a potential display of positive disposition towards fellow women through an effective homophily. Generally, people seem to report being surprised by females who use humor as a sort of expectancy violation, and we know from some of the evolutionary research why that may be, with females who use humor being perceived of as a little bit less typically feminine. Again, this potentially falls in line with evolutionary reasons for humor being utilized as a method of mate attraction used by men. This evolutionary role can be observed in women's increased attraction, particularly long-term put-a-ring-on-it level attraction towards men who use humor.
Sometimes I'll think of something that I think is funny, and I'll run it by her, and if she gives me total disapproval, I'll be like, that's a great joke. Like, if she is disgusted or mortified by what I say, I go, that's going in the act today.
In summation, again, it's not so much that women aren't funny or can't be funny. Of course they can. But rather, they don't have any real reason to be funny, just to restate. Thus, female comedians are a bit of an oddity. Finally, I want to give a few pieces of advice to women like Michelle Wolf. Stop relying entirely on other whores to find your grotesque, offensive humor funny. It's not doing you any favors. And while certainly the number of thoughts has been on the rise over the last 60 or so years, I still don't think it's enough to form a solid base. And we can see that every time one of these specials comes out, every time one of these films is released, and it gets panned by critics and women alike. People don't find you attractive when you insult others, and particularly when you insult other women and ruin the one thing you have going for you, disposition theory. So outside of those who feel some extreme homophily towards you because they are also rampant sleuths, no one else is ever going to enjoy your trash. I think Mark Stein summed it up fairly well here.
This is a smart, sophisticated Washington crowd in black tie, and they're listening to this woman using the F word, making a joke about how her private parts require a lot more yarn than those pink hats on the Trump parade. This is sophisticated wit for the smartest people in Washington. This is the death of comedy, because there's nothing the left can make honest jokes about except to mock Republicans as liars or uptight Christian fundamentalists hung up on abortion. Nothing else is left.
And yes, I will admit, you probably are at a significant disadvantage over men, who we not only anticipate to be funny more so than women, but who are just found more physically attractive by other women for being funny. But does that mean you can't be funny too? It doesn't. And it doesn't mean that it's going to negatively affect you in any kind of professional environment. Just write good material, and don't rely on sickening sex humor that other women, most of all, don't find enjoyable. And you might actually locate an audience capable of anything beyond hate watching your dumpster fire of a set. And that's why, yeah, women like Kathleen Madigan make me laugh my ass off. Because she doesn't rely on sex humor. She relies on witticisms and actually amusing jokes. So yes, to answer the question, are women funny? Sometimes. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.
Talking about our lives, and we both kind of realized we're kids. We're not men.
So then you asked yourselves, isn't there something more?
Yes.
Well, let me clue you in on something. There isn't.